Hello, guys. So today I'll be talking about someone that is rather a bit difficult to explain. So today we'll be talking about Immanuel Kant and his idea on freedom, what the highest good ought to be, and categorical imperative. Kant himself is a very impressive person. He has lived his whole life in a German village, in which I believe he taught philosophy. Um, and he has become one of the most influential thinker in his time. And we continue to study him because of his complex ideas on philosophy. If you do read his book on, a critique on pure reason, I think most people would find it a bit difficult to read, even in English. So today we'll begin with the idea of autonomy, right? So the idea is to give law to oneself, right? So what does it actually mean to give the idea of law to oneself? Is that we really think about giving a universal principle to yourself that would hold regardless of the circumstance. And that is what autonomy actually means in this case, whether or not you would be able to do so effectively under that frame. And the idea that he's really talking about, the most important idea here, is categorical imperative. It's really a universal ethical principle that respects human dignity. So one would say what he would do in most cases is that he respect individual persons and not seeing them as ends or means when they're conducting anything at all. Again, if you think about this, it's really simple in the sense that you're basically thinking about how do you treat other people, and how do you expect them to treat you, right? So you wouldn't want to treat them badly because essentially the people you treated badly would do probably the same to you. So that would be kind of the principle here as established. Is that understandable? Do you guys have any question? Feel free to speak up because it's really a philosophy class, and if you don't talk about much of anything, I won't be able to talk about much. Okay, so we're all good, and then we'll move on to the second idea, to the idea of maxim, right? So what is kind of the universal principle? What is kind of the maxim that we can reach? Is really the maxims would be, for one example, to let no insult pass unavenged, and to increase my wealth by every safe means. So these are all kind of the maxims that we could act on. And again, these might be inconsistent with different ideas, right? But the assumption is that because we are rational beings, because we are people who can deliberate, who can think rationally, our action would always have some kind of a goal, right? An end. And what that would be at the end would be, I guess, the idea of maxim. And then if we say, really, later on, we'll talk a little bit more about really what's kind of the principle in terms of maxim, and what are kind of the different views on how do we utilize this idea of maxim. And Kant's idea is really that our actions are not based of pure desires, right? So it would be very specific in the case that if I want to drink some coffee, my maxim is really to go and get the coffee to satisfy a certain desire. We'll see later on why Kant think in the most of the senses that our actions are not bound by our desires. So we say these are two two principles here, right? One is we say this is material, and the other one is really formal. And again, if we refer back to the idea of material, really, again, he used the word hypothetical imperatives. Is the idea that I should act in a certain way to satisfy some desire, right? So, for example, if I say only act to pursue something to get a result, right, to satisfy a desire, that would be example of this material principle. Again, we'll see later on, if we see more the idea of formal principle, we'll see why that differs. Really, the other one is really formal principle, is really without reference to any desire, right? So again, this is rather consistent with the idea of categorical imperative, right? So it's really unconditional, right? This categorical imperative is really commanding without really any condition that you should act in a certain way, right? So if we say, I'm just going to ask a question here. If we say murder, what would categorical imperative say in this case, in Kant's case? So I'll just move on to explain a bit more about this, right? So if we again talk about the idea of categorical principle, it's really that moral laws are seen as categorical imperatives. So the idea of morally helping someone, really the idea of helping someone is because you want to help them. It's because it's non-conditional. And again, the question here is really that if you say you want to steal, right? And steal would be, if you want to steal because that you're hungry. Say you want to steal because you're hungry, right? This would fit in to the frame of really the material principle, right? But it wouldn't fit into the categorical principle, because there are some things that is really moral laws that really, I guess, in this case, would be unconditional. Does that make sense? So there's no between in categorical moral principles, right? So it's either permitted or it's not permitted. So if we refer back to the case of murder or stealing or anything of similar kind, it will be exactly that. Okay, sorry, I'll just share my screen again. Can you guys see the slides right now? Okay, great. So again, the idea of this, it really is non-conditional as to what categorical moral imperatives actually mean, right? Again, if we think about it in another sense, right? So if you want to help someone, say if you're a shopkeeper, right? And you're giving changes to the customers. So in this case, you can either shortchange the customer because of very different reasons, or you cannot shortchange the customers for a different reason, right? So you can simply not shortchange the customer because you want to be an honest shopkeeper. And the other moral reason behind that would be that I do not want myself to have a bad reputation as a bad shopkeeper, so that people won't come into my shop anymore. And because of that reason, I choose to give the correct changes to my customer. Can anyone say what's the difference between the two scenarios in the shopkeeper case? You can type it in the chat if you don't want to speak. So does anyone want to respond to this? If not, I'll just explain a bit more. So there are basically two notions here, right? Two kinds of morals. There's one that is non-conditional. The first case, because you are an honest shopkeeper, and then you do so because this is the correct thing to do. And the other one is that you see it more in the sense that if you give the right change, people would come back to your shop, right? So the which makes a difference in the moral reasoning here, right? Because one is because it is the right thing to do, and the other one is because it benefits you in the long term, right? So of course there will be a difference between the two in that sense, and if you choose the right reason, say simply because it is right to give the right change, then Kant would agree in the sense that it fits in the framework of categorical moral principle. And the other one would not, because it really refers to a selfish notion of what that ought to be. Does that make sense when we speak about the categorical moral principle? Because you see two different lines of reasoning here, right? And if we refer back to Jeremy Bentham's idea on utilitarianism, it wouldn't make a difference, right? Because in utilitarianism, the only thing that matters is the result, right? So in this case, if the shopkeeper chooses to give the same exact change, then the results are fine. So there's nothing morally, say, different between them. But in Kant's idea, because something basically shortchanging your customer is stealing, then it will be morally wrong. Hence, there's a difference between the different type of moral reasoning that they're using in this case. And we'll just move on to the next idea, right? So the idea now comes to the notion of freedom, right? The notion of autonomy. So if we only act to satisfy the desires that we have, we're not free. We're not really what you desire are not within your control. So insofar as we choose to act to satisfy desires, we're choosing to let nature govern us rather than ourselves choosing to governing ourselves. Again, we're referring back to the idea of autonomy, right? So there's playing, there's the idea of pain and pleasure. And Bentham's idea is exactly the opposite as Kant, right? Bentham said that pain is really the sovereign masters of humankind, right? You want less pain. You want more happiness. And Kant really now says exactly the different thing, exactly the opposite. Can anyone tell me whether or not they think Kant's reasoning about nature as should not be our sovereign masters? Can anybody tell me that whether or not this conception of freedom is compelling or not? Is it reasonable for us to assume that? Does anyone want to answer this question? Okay, so if not, I'll just keep on explaining as to what those principles are. So the idea, again, we refer to two ideas as we talked about previously. One is really we focus on the material principle, right? The other one is really on the formal principle, right? So if we only act on the material principle, right, we're only driven by nature, by our desires, then it is not us that gives the laws to ourselves. It is rather the nature that dictates really the actions that we have, and laws that it's really basically nature giving laws to us rather than us giving laws to ourselves. Does that make sense? So that would basically mean that we should not only act on moral principle because of this reason, because we are not free, because we are not autonomous. And autonomous or freedom is essential to achieving categorical moral principle, or categorical imperative in this case. And again, we're just going to rephrase and go back a bit to the idea of freedom. And do we have any questions at this point as to what Kant is trying to express? But I would assume that you understand at this point. Can anybody read the second paragraph of the case of Kant's freedom? The example that Kant talked about, right, about theft. Can anybody give me an account on that, on whether or not they believe? What does that actually mean? Or, you know, give me a reason why we should believe in Kant's reasoning, or that we should not believe in Kant's reasoning about theft. Does anybody want to answer that? Okay, so again, so Sophia, can you explain a bit more as to what you do not understand in this case? Again, I would just say Kant is a very difficult thinker. I think his ideas are very difficult and much more complex comparing to the other people. So can I restate which part of Kant's idea? Would it be freedom, or autonomy, or categorical moral principle? Okay, so I'll just go back to the idea of autonomy, right? Again, the idea of autonomy is based on the idea that we give laws to ourselves, right? We give laws to ourselves. What that actually means in this case is if we look at the two different two different principles, right? One is material, the other one is formal. So if we look at the material principle, we're acting, we are basically conducting our actions because we have certain desires, right? These desires are generally because due to natural reasons, right? Because say if you don't have food, it would be nature in us, right? Our desires that dictate what ought to happen. And that's very different from you yourself as an autonomous individual, well, making certain laws for yourself. And that is the definition of autonomy that Kant uses, whether or not you can give the laws to yourself and act on its behalf and not be controlled by your personal desires. So it would be wrong to act simply because you have certain desires. You might arrive at the same end, meaning that in the case of shopkeeper that I refer to, you might again give the right change, but because of different reasons. And what Kant is looking at is not whether or not you give the right change, is rather that what is the reason behind your action. So that defines the idea of autonomy in this case. So again, if we go back to freedom, and think about what Kant's view on autonomy, can we take a look at the second example about theft and whether or not that we think Kant's reasoning is compelling enough for us to believe it? Right? What Kant says is that in order for one person to be wrong, he must be able to control. He must be able to control himself. He must be a free agent for him to be wrong. So if he's not at the state of a free agent, sure, you can punish him, but it's doubtful that he's morally wrong, his action. Right? So can anyone go a bit further as to what he means by free agent in this case? If not, I'll just explain a bit more about what this actually means. Does anybody have a take on this? On what this actually means? As to what Kant is trying to express? So again, if nobody raised their hand or want to say anything, I'll just go on and explain a bit further. So again, the idea that we've heard here, again, is whether or not a person is autonomous, right? If he's not free, he's not autonomous. So what this actually means is that if we go back to the principle, right? If you only act on the principle that refers to material, if you only act on that material principle, basically doing everything you have done because of your personal desires, that would not make you a free agent. Therefore, I think in this case, it's really doubtful to say whether or not that you're morally wrong because you're fundamentally not free. And then moral rightness or wrongness could only apply to people who are free, who can, I guess, have certain control in their power. Then you would be able to say whether or not they acted rightly or wrongly. Does that make sense for everyone? So again, if I'll just say this, so if a person has no money, right, he cannot purchase anything, and he's in hunger, he's in desperate hunger, and because of his hunger, he did not purchase, he stole bread from other people, right? In this case, would he be morally wrong? I guess according to Kant, he wouldn't be morally wrong, right? Because he's not free. He's acting on, again, the principle we call as desire. He's trying to fulfill his basic desire. He wasn't able to act rationally, and therefore he's not free. If he's not free, it's very difficult to say whether or not that we can say his action is right or wrong. And I think that's the question, whether or not a person is a free agent is what we are trying to determine here. And again, we have two senses of what Kant's philosophy is. One sense is whether or not it's theoretical, and the other one is practical, right? So the idea, again, is really on the theoretical side, it's self-consciousness, right? So whether or not that we would know the maxim of the basic laws of nature. And the other one is moral law. So basically, in the life that we live in, basically the practical life that we have, it's really that how do we really understand categorical moral principle or categorical imperatives, which is the moral law. And given the reflection on those ideas, then it would lead to an ideal world where highest good can be achieved. And that is just philosophically what his ideas ought to be in this case. Again, we'll talk a bit more about the highest good in this case. Can anybody go through passage 1 and tell me what they think about passage 1, the first passage? Does anyone have a question at this point as to what Kant is trying to explain and what his reasonings are, and on the idea of autonomy, freedom, or categorical moral principle? Well, I'm assuming that you don't have any of those questions. So I'll just move on to the next part. So again, if we move on, we would see that moral law, again, is purely the formal principles. So we act on maxims, or basically universal laws. We do not act on it if it's not universal, right? Again, the idea of that would really be, if we take a look at the example, I should help others, indeed not at bottom, because doing so would make me feel good, right? But rather because it is the right thing to do, right? Because it is right to help other people in need. Therefore, this would be a universal law. Does that make sense for everyone as to what Kant is trying to express? Can anyone tell me what they think it means? All right, I'll just explain it then, or just to give you a bit more of an idea. Yes, so the question here, right, Angela said, does he mean that we shouldn't help people if it is for our own benefit? I think the answer is yes, right? So it should not be because you help, it should not be, basically, you can't give an example of helping people, right? You help people because it is the right thing to do, not because it would make you feel good, not because it would make you happy, but because that it is the right thing to do. And if it is the right thing to do, then it would become a moral law. It would become a universal principle. Does that make sense for everyone? Or do you have any more questions? Well, I think the part about universal law could be tricky, right? So if you think about this question a bit further, what is the universal principle? Although Kant did elaborate as to what those maxims are and how do we establish universal principle, right? It's really difficult in some of the times, right? And it's difficult for us, especially as well, whether or not we're a free agent is one thing, right? Whether or not we can truly be free in the state he described it. And the other thing is whether or not we can really understand these moral principles, right? And establish these moral principles. I think that would be very difficult. Again, Kant established a bit more as to a perfectly moral world. So there must be a combination of virtue and happiness together that would constitute the highest good in a person. Or, really, if you add these things up, and you would have essentially the highest good possible in the world, if that makes sense. So if you only have happiness or virtue, you need to have both to achieve that effect. Does that make sense for everyone? It's really just really a hypothesis that goes on as Kant explained a bit further as to what he actually means. And this is really the end of what I was about to say in this lecture as to what the principles are of Kant and what his moral reasonings are. Do you have any more questions? If not, I'll just recommend that you read Kant's A Critique on Pure Reason. It could be something interesting if you just want to read the original language and how does Kant really well deduct his results in a scientific way or mathematical way. If you want to read that, I think it would be very interesting. Do you have any more questions as to what Kant actually means by autonomy, or how universal can this principle be? Do you have any of those questions? If not, we'll just end today. And I just like to say this because it's really a philosophy class, so there's no right or wrong, or any notion of whether or not one thing is right or wrong in this class. And just if you have any questions, speak up, and if you don't have any questions, that's totally fine as well. And I guess that's the end of the class if you don't have any questions for me. Thank you so much for taking this class, and I wish you a great day and a great weekend. Thank you so much.